I, along with I think many of you, owe Quincy an apology. Quincy, we are sorry for joining in on the dog pile throwing dirt on your name for the last 10 or so years. A running joke about Quincy has been to call him trash and a boy. But again, after really sitting with the film and breaking it down, I feel like this is pretty unfair to him. Now, is Quincy a catch? Like, would I set Quincy up with one of my homegirls based on his behavior in the movie? Probably not. But Quincy had earned like future adjacent reputation. I called him a boy probably in like 2 different videos. And maybe it's not y'all, maybe it's me, but I need to make sure that it's clear that that label doesn't really stick. So today we're gonna get away from high interest topics and get back to the channel's roots for a little bit, kind of cleanse the palate, because I got some high interest stuff coming up and I kind of want to exhale from a little bit of the drama, although there may be some drama coming my way from this one. And just get back to talking about black movies. And I said a little while ago in the Black Men in Love video that maybe I take a shot at analyzing Love and Basketball. For a lot of folks in my generation, Love and Basketball is one of the most beloved movies, especially romance films, from that era. And for some in that same generation, reevaluating it through a modern context has led many of us to look at it as yet another example of a piece of art that needs to be locked in its time period.
I got it. Told you I was nice. I'm gonna be the first girl in the NBA. No, I'm gonna be in the NBA. You're gonna be my cheerleader.
In fact, I was one of those people who looked back at this movie and thought to myself, really, is this what we look to as relationship goals? I'm thinking that maybe we overcorrected for the flaws in this movie a bit. Yes, the relationship from Love and Basketball maybe shouldn't get the same level of adoration that it did from so many aging millennials 20 years ago. I also feel like the recent backlash and looking at the movie as a relic of its time is far too simplistic of a hot take. So this video is gonna be my backlash to the backlash. I'm here to state that Love and Basketball is actually much more timely than ever as a love story because it's much deeper and more complex than most of us who watched it at 18 years old, 20 something years ago, could really give it credit for. Sure, as an 18-year-old, I myself idolized the classic childhood friends fall in love trope, and of course the classic yet still very cringy even now ending scene. But the adult in me who's married with children, who's watched the rise of, I'm just gonna say, black dating advice spaces increase over the last couple of years, both for men and for women, and how that space is kind of turned into a dumpster fire. And don't even get me started on Clubhouse.
Communication is down there with the friendship thing.
Hey, yo,
You know what I
Wack.
mean?
Hey, yo, Wack. I agree with you 100%. It's Mr. Banks speaking. You know, when I met my wife, we've been married going on 7 years now, and I told her at our first date, I'm gonna have like 4, 5 wives. And her response was like, more power to you. And that heifer has been with me and on to the 5th child. I mean, I don't know where she come from.
I feel like maybe going back to Love and Basketball might be more useful today than it would have been 20 years ago. We don't give enough credit to Love and Basketball for how actually complex the love story here was, and how, if you're paying attention, you recognize that these characters maneuver around each other, their own needs, and love greatly with the concepts of gender and sexuality centered in the movie. What I'm saying is that there's much more to this movie than hashtag relationship goals or Quincy is trash. Sure, there's truth to both of those responses, but if you're on my channel, then you know I don't stop at the surface level. So I want you all to follow me and give me some grace. This is just my opinion based on my analysis, as I break down some of the more profound and maybe critical messages this movie has to offer and how they actually provide a nice bit of perspective on modern challenges that black men and black women, and to be honest, anyone has, maneuvering concepts of gender and sexuality when pursuing intimacy. I won't spend a ton of time going over the background of Love and Basketball, the historical context. A lot of that can be just pulled directly from the Black Man in Love video when I'm talking about Love Jones. But I think it's interesting that his director, Gina Price by the Wood, isn't a household name, because I definitely, after watching this movie 1,000 times, especially during college, never knew it was even directed by a woman, let alone a woman who has had a pretty prolific career in Hollywood behind the cameras. Because not only did she direct this, she also directed The Secret Life of Bees. She directed last year's surprise hit on Netflix, The Old Guard. And she has writing and directing credits on a lot of great Black sitcoms, such as The Bernie Mac Show, A Different World, and The Forgotten Gem South Central. The film is loosely based on her experiences with love as a collegiate level athlete, and that really plays a lot into the movie, but we'll come back to that. And it stars two interesting figures in what's often known as the famous to Black people section of Hollywood, Omar Epps and Sanaa Lathan. And which is sad, because both of these actors were actually pretty talented and should have really gotten farther in Hollywood. Epps in particular seemed like he was burgeoning on being a breakout star, but I guess, you know, Hollywood just doesn't have a ton of space for Black A-listers, whether they be male or female. And so I guess he couldn't beat out Denzel or Will or, I don't know, Jamie Foxx for those top positions. Because early in his career with movies like The Program and Juice and Higher Learning, you would have thought that Epps was on his way to being something significant. And a similar thing can be said about Sanaa Lathan. Sanaa is well-trained. She has family connections in Hollywood. She went to Yale for fine arts. There's rumors about Sanaa Lathan being kind of a bad girl behind the scenes, but I don't give a ton of credit to that, because those rumors follow pretty much any Black woman, or darn near most women in Hollywood. She still carved out a pretty strong spot in Hollywood, mostly as a character actress, playing the typical Black love interest that she fits well in, although she has had a few cool spots, especially popping up in Alien vs. Predator a few years back. Aside from that, this movie does have an all-star cast. There's the Allstate Man, a young Gabrielle Union, Kyla Pratt, Tyra Banks, Afri Woodard, Debbie Morgan, Boris Cujo, and Barack Obama. Really, this is a whole famous to Black people crew here, and it's a classic for a reason, because all of them give really good performances. The only other thing of note to point out is that this was probably the best of the movies trying to imitate the success of Love Jones, because you had stuff like The Wood and Brown Sugar, and there's a lot of Black cinema from all different genres, but it does seem like the pure romantic drama was very sparse at this point in time. Like today you have stuff like The Photograph and Sylvie's Love and If Beale Street Can Talk, but like that wasn't happening 20 years ago. You had a handful of entries, and then Tyler Perry came in and basically ruined Black movies for 4 or 5 years. And because this was one of the few Black romance dramas that really was of a high quality, it was a hit for a lot of millennials and probably young Gen Zers over the course of these years. This is a lot of people's favorite all-time movie and love story. That is, until we all collectively decided that it was overrated and toxic in the Twitter hot take era of the last couple of years. The movie went from being seen as classic to a meme about how toxic Black love stories are. And of course, there were tons of jokes on that final scene. But my question is, does it really deserve that backlash? Or are we just memeing it to death and dogpiling on it because it's a cool and funny thing to do? So let's look at it critically to summarize. We meet Quincy and Monica as preteens, and they have a love-hate relationship, but they're close friends because they live next door to each other until the end of high school, where they finally decide to make themselves an official couple. However, in that first year of college, things don't quite go right.
Man, you gonna take us to the Final Four?
We'll see.
I'll be watching.
Hope so.
Right? They break up, they both try to go their separate ways, living lives that they think will be more fulfilling based on what they thought as, you know, college freshmen. And when those things don't quite work out, they find their way back to each other and they live happily ever after, we presume. That's a very short summary. Oh, spoilers, I guess. Because so much is going on within that love story, which is that there's a lot of explicit messaging about gender and gender performance that these children are both exposed to and represent, and that all of this stuff manifests in their characters and the way they view the world.
Now, see, Quincy, this is how your mom's caught me, with the old faking babe.
Can't do this shit.
Well, what did I tell you about using that word?
Can't should never be in a man's vocabulary.
And why not?
Because when you say can't, you ain't a man.
That's right.
Monica and Quincy both come from classically patriarchal households. Both of their mothers are married to, and I hate that I'm going to use this term, but I have to for the sake of being critical about some of the things about gender and kind of connecting that to this unfortunate dating advice space that I see on YouTube. So both of these children's fathers are high value men, which means I have to now define that. What is a high value man? One notable dating guru offers a 6-piece definition of the concept in a video where he couldn't even be bothered to sync his audio appropriately.
It really throws people off because it seems so cold, so calculated. But like it or not, that's the way the world is. Yeah, anybody can have a great season, but having a great season does not automatically mean you're going to the Hall of Fame. They want to see.
The definition he gives, though, essentially defines it as men who stand out from other men in terms of one thing, which is personal capital and resources, which I guess makes some sense. I've also looked at the concept as presented through various women-oriented and women-ran dating communities, and the definition is a bit more varied, but the same things arise in terms of a man who has access to capital, but at least I see more women putting in emphasis on terms of attractiveness and character and things like that. But it's still pretty vague and hard to define. Ironically, the goal for both sides of this gender divide in defining this concept is pretty clear and come together on some level. For the men, being a high value man lets you assert access to patriarchal power and influence and freedom that is supposedly provided to these men that can perform gender at this level. And for women, pursuing these types of men will allow you to be fulfilled as women and offer protection and access to power and stability under these benevolent patriarchs, because we all know how benevolent patriarchy tends to be. But in short, men want to be high value and women want men who are high value. And I hope it's understood that I'm talking about cis hetero relationships. And I think this concept of high value men and women and wanting to have access to patriarchy goes across race and gender on a lot of aspects. But for the most part, especially in the context of this movie, I'm talking about cis hetero relationships. That said, if you look at the concept critically and from a sociological standpoint, you'll recognize that this whole concept of a high value man fits pretty well under the concept of hegemonic masculinity by sociologist R.W. Connell. Hegemonic masculinity basically describes a lot of things about how masculinity works in society, but to simplify it, it essentially explains why men dominate and what types of men tend to dominate a social or political space. And we refer to those dominant positions as hegemons. So like Tom Brady is the hegemon of pro football and Beyonce is the hegemon of pop music and so on. Hegemonic masculinity is a conceptual framework that helps us understand what elements of masculine gender dominate socially in a given space. And so in our white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, we can pretty much expect that a man performing masculinity at the hegemonic level will have access to money and capital, which I mentioned before, but they'll also behave and present in a way that is deemed appropriate for masculinity within the culture that they come from. And in most cases, especially if you're a fan of certain crowds of dating gurus, these men are usually white. And I want to be clear that hegemonic masculinity is a concept that's meant to explain a problem, as in the problem of patriarchy within society, aka the consolidation and abuse of power of men of varying levels of gender performance, and how that marginalizes not just women, but other men who can't perform masculinity at that same level. And to be fair to everyone that's trying to be this or be with this, understand that the teaching of patriarchy is something that we're given as children, whether it's boys being told that this is the type of man you want to be, or girls being told that this is the type of man you want to be with. In isolation, some of the traits that we usually attach to masculinity, like courage and bravery and selflessness, traits that are not unique to men, but they're seen as classically masculine traits. These are not bad things. And I know many men who have these traits who are good men, good fathers, good husbands, etc. However, the culture that is built around trying to reproduce this performance of masculinity and the pursuit of men who perform this level of masculinity is saturated with toxicity, especially in the social media dating advice sphere. There's a lot of reasons why that is, and that will lead me further off into a tangent. But for now and for this film, I just want to point out that it's the complexities of what it means to perform and be partnered to this hegemonic, aka high valued man status that drives much of the movie's conflict and themes. In short, Monica and Quincy are avatars for us to explore normative standards and expectations of gender and what is good and or bad gender performance and why that is, and how all of this can be a very complex thing to deal with when you're pursuing love and partnership. For Quincy, the only child of Zeke and Nona McCall, the concept of masculinity is mostly attached to his relationship with his father and his adulation and need for approval from his father, who he sees as an ideal man. And Zeke is the quintessential high-value man, especially for a lot of black folks, being a former professional athlete. This ability to play ball has afforded him, his wife, and his son a great life, and he is making it a point to instill within his son the values that he thinks are going to lead him to a similar path, and at least at the beginning, it's clear that things are going well. Although there is a not at all subtle undercurrent of misogyny that permeates that household, and we see that immediately with Quincy in terms of his behavior towards a young Monica, who does not fall under the line of patriarchal expectations of how a girl is supposed to act, and that creates conflict.
Cause you're my girl now, you gotta ride on my bike. But I wanna ride my own bike. My dad always drives my mom. So that means I have to ride you. Come on. I don't have to do what you say. Forget you then, stupid. You stupid, and your dad plays for the worst team in the NBA. What? Last time they won, Dr. J was a nurse. Shut up.
This moment is one of those it was a different time things. The movie wants us to see this as them just being competitive and fiery toward each other. And to be fair, this is definitely how little boys and little girls might behave toward each other then and now. But I want to point out that this is not just the influence of Zeke, but also his mother, Nona, who is clearly just as invested in the patriarchal and misogynistic culture of their household, which we see later.
What is this? I look like some hoochie to you? I found it on your bed.
Mom, what you doing in my room?
Quincy, I have told you about these fast-ass girls.
Mom, we were just studying.
Boy, I'm not playing with you. Now, I'm telling you, these girls are looking to get you caught. They see you and they see dollar signs.
What that tells us is that Quincy's concept of gender and masculinity is firstly a response to him wanting to be like his father and not necessarily a manifestation of who he really is or might grow to be. He plays basketball because he's good at it, and that's what his father does. He flirts with a lot of girls because they are thirsty for him, and that's what a popular athlete is supposed to do. It's not overt, but it's clear, especially at the end, that Quincy isn't all that passionate about any of the things he spends most of his life pursuing. In fact, the only thing that Quincy seems to be explicitly in for himself is Monica. On the flip side, we have Monica. We meet young Monica moving to the West Coast with her parents, Camille and Nathan Wright, along with her older and more classically feminine sister, Lena. And this is Monica's story more than it is Quincy. We spend more time with Monica and seeing the story play out from Monica's perspective, which is very unique, but because it's based on the experiences of the director, it makes sense. While Quincy's conflict with masculinity simmers below the surface, Monica's conflict with classical femininity is immediately present. Young Monica is a complete tomboy to the fact that she's mistaken as a boy when she first meets Quincy in the early scenes of the movie. While Quincy is taught and modeled masculinity from his hegemonic father, Monica's hegemonic father is greatly absent in the film. As a man with no sons who plays the classical patriarchal role in his household, he seems to be greatly absent from the core of child rearing. And like many patriarchal households, even those without men in them, the responsibility for teaching the patriarchal values of our society falls on the mother.
I was just showing emotion.
So it's all right for you to act like that?
Oh, what'd you do?
Nothing. I don't know why I keep hoping you'll grow out of this tomboy thing.
And I get why that is, because when you hear a man, a cis hetero black man say that, it sounds like we're just trying to blame women for the problems that they experience, because let's be clear, men benefit far more from patriarchy than anybody, especially heterosexual men and especially white men. And when you dive into the manosphere, whether it's white or black, and you hear the rhetoric of how women are talked about, especially black women in some of these circles, it makes it difficult to have this conversation, but that doesn't change the reality here in this piece of the conversation that's being left out. For black men in particular, we're talking about 4 or 5 generations of black boys raised in women-led households, even when the fathers are in the home. Patriarchy absolves men of accountability for teaching social morals in the home. That responsibility is often thrust upon women, leaving women to be held accountable if their sons or daughters do not perform their gender appropriately. And again, this is not absolving men from their role in the reproduction of patriarchy. This is something that sociological scholars, including channel favorite Bell Hooks, have pointed out for a while now. We need to highlight the role women play in perpetuating and sustaining patriarchal culture so that we will recognize patriarchy as a system women and men support equally, even if men receive more rewards from that system. Dismantling and changing patriarchal culture is work that men and women must do together. And that's a lovely sentiment, Auntie Hooks, but you must not have been on Clubhouse recently to see how that working together thing is going. It's not going well.
Bedwenching. Thank you, Tariq, for naming an entire group of women. When black men marry,
ma'am, you're a funky bedwench. You're not you're a funky bedwench.
No.
Looking at this movie, we do get some perspective on how that kind of looks. In Monica's case, her mother and her come into conflict consistently because Monica isn't performing gender as she's expected. And that expected gender performance is something that Kano calls emphasized femininity, which is essentially the counterpart to hegemonic masculinity. Y'all might call them pick-me's. I don't really know. But the point is, you emphasize the features that a hegemonic man would be expected to appreciate the most. This is usually the core of the advice you'll hear from a lot of male dating gurus. And I'm sure a lot of female dating gurus will try to say the same thing about how a woman should act and behave in order to attract men. And we see the drawback to that in Monica's mother as a character. Because Monica's mother had career dreams and dropped those to perform being a housewife for her high-value men. There is a sense of loss for Camille in having to abandon her personal dreams, but she at least does point out that she is very satisfied with having been able to be such an engaged mother and being a supporting wife to a high-value man. And I want to point out, and I'm going to talk about this more later, I am not here to call out or disagree with traditional conceptualizations of relationships and partnerships and marriage and all that stuff. Not here to do that. But what I do want to get at is how overly simplistic we tend to treat how that stuff works, and how so many of the flaws and issues and problems within community and within other communities are kind of tied to our adherence and worship of this classically conservative conceptualization of Black families and Black love. But I'll come back to that in a second. The point I'm trying to make is that Monica was not a fan of the way her mother's life and gender performance played out. They don't have a volatile conflict, but they do have moments where her mother throws subtle shade at her over and over again. And I know from talking to Black women that this type of abuse does add up to be very harmful over a long period of time. Now, in defense of this reality, as I've said before, Black people as a whole have never been guaranteed access to the American dream. In fact, in many cases, we've been outright barred from it. However, in those rare instances where this access is granted, there's a sense of accomplishment and almost duty that comes with it. It's why I've always found it hard to categorically denounce like Black liberals and even sometimes Black conservatives, because I understand there's a psychological wound in play, one that I still suffer from myself, that is not of our own creating, something that people think they can only heal through winning at capitalism, winning at patriarchy, or possibly dating outside their race. And I want to again be clear, I am not against interracial relationships, but I am concerned about how some people in both of these communities position dating people outside of their race as a key to feeling better about who they are or improving their station in life. And like, no, that's not true on any level. We see this muted sense of camaraderie over the shared experience of being Black women and Black families who married well between Camille and Nona when they meet early in the movie. Nona, having been surrounded by white women, is happy to see another Black woman of the same status. It probably eases her survivor's guilt as seen through the weird jokes she makes. Camille, on the other hand, being from Atlanta, which even then was known for money Black people, is less struck by her presence and is more put off by Lena's less submissive and conservative presentation. It's a complex situation there. But the point I want to get across is that Camille and Nona, along with their husbands, both feel like they're winners at this stage in life in the movie. And they're trying to impart this winning strategy on their children. And I think that's important to point out, is that the reproduction of harmful ideologies, whether they be about gender or race, is not explicitly just we want to do harm to these groups or to these people or to women or to men. It's that we assume, we think because this is all we know, that this is what's best for our children and that's what we give them. It takes a conscious effort to remove that.
Please. You jump in some guy's face, you talk smack, and you get a pat on your ass. But because I'm a female, I get told to calm down and act like a lady. I'm a ball player, okay?
So let's talk about Quincy. And before we start, I, along with I think many of you, owe Quincy an apology. Quincy, we are sorry for joining in on the dog pile, throwing dirt on your name for the last 10 or so years. A running joke about Quincy has been to call him trash and a fuckboy. But again, after really sitting with the film and breaking it down, I feel like this is pretty unfair to him. Now, is Quincy a catch? Like, would I set Quincy up with one of my homegirls based on his behavior in the movie? Probably not. But Quincy had earned like future Jace reputation. I called him a fuckboy probably in like 2 different videos. And maybe it's not y'all, maybe it's me, but I need to make sure that it's clear that that label doesn't really stick. In fact, in retrospect, I find Quincy's character and insight into the Black masculine experience to be pretty deep and insightful. Quincy's arc of trying to find purpose and perform masculinity under the specter of his flawed father is really significant and more complex than a lot of men get to portray in media. But let's start with the elephant in the room. Is Quincy a fuckboy? For one, let's recognize that Quincy does not offer commitment to any woman except Monica in the film. We see Quincy garner attention and engage in heavy petting with other women, and he definitely acts out right before he breaks up with Monica. So it's not to say that Quincy doesn't have maybe some fuckboy tendencies, but it's clear that Quincy isn't the playboy we're trying to see him as. He rejects clear invitations to hook up early in the movie. He rejects going further with Gabrielle Union's thirsty-ass character, and that's greatly because his heart was really with Monica. Another character beat that I think a lot of people miss is their first night together sexually. It's not heavily alluded to, but it's arguable looking at Omar Epps' performance here that this may be Quincy's first sexual experience, or he may not have much experience to begin with. And that tells us either that he's very disciplined in not having sex with all the girls he could, especially when it's clear how many women are throwing themselves at him. And if he does have experience, it's even more commendable with how gentle and careful he ends with Monica, who definitely has no experience at this point. Quincy doesn't make the first move. He lets things go at her pace. He stops to make sure to put on a condom and even checks in with her mid-coitus to make sure she's okay. This, especially by the standards of the late 90s, early 2000s, is quite progressive of him. And I'm just gonna say it, that's not what Future would do. It's also insinuated by a lot of people that he cheats on Monica with the girl from Best Man, but that's actually, there's no proof that that happened. He denies it, and the story doesn't really show us that, which tells us it's probably not real. But the key thing here is that at this point, he was done with the relationship and he broke things off with her right there. And again, that's very responsible of him to cut things off when he realizes that the relationship is not going where he plans to go with his life. And I'll explain more about that later. But I just want to point out that it's commendable that he ended it at that point before anybody really got hurt even further. Now, this doesn't absolve Quincy for being a bad boyfriend, but I don't know how many 19-year-olds are good boyfriends. Now, looking at Quincy beyond just our criticism as a boyfriend, we see a lot of interesting things. To me, Quincy is a useful example of how Black men can often feel constricted and erased by how people perceive them. We're getting back into that W.E.B. Du Bois double consciousness thing again. In short, the double consciousness is a concept that explains how Black people in general have to contend with a complex and potent set of assumptions and ideas about who they are based solely on being Black and trying to manage that with their actual sense of self. In Quincy's case, he is the son of a pro athlete with a clear expectation that he will reach the same level of success and status. His father is teaching him to move through the world with classically masculine principles, and everyone treats him like the men. The question that is slightly hinted at, though, but not confirmed until the end, is whether or not any of this is really him, or if it's just a path that he's following because that's what's expected. I compare him a lot to Insecure's Lawrence, who I pointed out in another video that Lawrence is labeled by other characters that he deals with as this high-value alpha male, but in reality, he's just an awkward dork that doesn't really know what he's doing and is trying to figure life out himself. He just happens to look the part. And that brings us to another thing that we don't really talk about with black male characters, which is what does it do to a guy's psyche to attract women so easily and so consistently? Now, this may sound like first world problems to some people. It definitely would be to me, but I've seen firsthand the weird struggle of having women throw themselves at you all the time, among a lot of other issues that can cause. It also has a depersonalizing effect on men, especially if you are of a high status, because you begin to lose track of how you present in the world. That double consciousness gets intensified. You wonder what people see in you. Are these women attracted to you because of who they think you are or because of who you think you are? Relationships begin to feel very transactional. And from my perspective, a lot of these men don't ever figure out how to develop meaningful connections because women are so interchangeable to them. And then they get older and you have a lot of them not doing all that good, which is basically what happens to Quincy's father. What I'm getting at here is that Quincy is probably a guy who only feels truly understood and connected to one person in his life, and that's Monica, which makes their breakup later that much more interesting. Monica's arc is a bit more straightforward and obvious to catch to the viewer. Monica is the tomboy character with a bit more depth. Tomboy tropes are often either played for jokes or their tomboy behavior is an arc where the goal that they come to is to just become more feminine and that solves all their problems. And like, there can be interesting stories there, but you kind of see how that can be problematic. But Monica defies that trope. It's made clear that Monica is just a fighter and competitor. Her conflict isn't this issue with emphasized femininity, it's just that that's not the type of femininity she's into. And this all seems like an aversion to her mother's very submissive status in their home. We're treated to a scene early on where Monica's father comes in and just dumps domestic labor on his wife. Later in the movie, Monica has to argue with her mom where she complains that her mom never stood up for herself and that she doesn't like that she gave up on her dream.
So that's why we can't get along? Because I'd rather shoot a stupid jump shot?
You ones always turn your nose up at me. That is ridiculous.
What's ridiculous is not being a caterer. So your husband can feel like a man knowing his woman's home cooking and ironing his drawers.
It's arguable that Monica's intensity on the court is a byproduct of this conflict of being like her mother and her mother's ongoing pressure for her to perform femininity in a more traditional sense. But unlike the usual trope for the tomboy, Monica's rejection of femininity isn't a byproduct of insecurity. It's mostly just because basketball is life. There's not too often where we get sports stories and scenes with women, especially black women, so it's interesting and subversive that we get so many from Monica in this movie. And in the first basketball game scene, we are in her point of view and in her head as she plays. But we also see that her intensity gets her in trouble as she stares down a girl after blocking her shot, Alonzo Mourning style. Monica feels the pressure of society's desire for her to conform to a more traditional gender performance, but unlike Quincy, she isn't very well suited for it. She complains about her aggression on the court will be seen as a virtue if she were a guy. She struggles with moments of insecurity when she sees more classy feminine women throw themselves at Quincy, and it doesn't help that he definitely plays into it. But she still, after that, rejects the pressure to conform and uses her passion and intensity to pursue her dreams. That's what comes first. And it's also that same passion and intensity that Quincy is clearly attracted to. All of this is sadly undercut, I think, by the movie's need to still fit Monica's arc into a normative framework for a woman falling in love and being chose, and that being her prime directive. The breakup scene where Monica basically begs to stay with Quincy is a bit hard to watch, but it does fit for her as this passionate girl that doesn't want to hide her feelings or play coy. And let's be real, this happens in real life, and we've seen this scene many times in movies when the genders are reversed and it doesn't really set off any alarms. In fact, I think the reversal of gender roles in this movie is probably why it came under so much scrutiny and criticism in the last couple of years, but I'll save that for later. It also kind of doesn't make sense that she would lose her passion for basketball later in the movie when she finally gets to start playing at the highest level. Now, it's realistic that you might feel lonely in a foreign country and all that, but it's pretty clear that a lot of this is tied to her separation from Quincy. It felt like a cop-out for her to get her dream and then not appreciate it because she didn't have a man beside her. It conflicts with a lot of the movie's other underlying messages. Despite the fact that their characters have all of these messages about gender conflict going on, the thing that makes this movie so good and so beloved is that none of that really makes their connection seem less natural or less appealing to the viewer. Unlike a lot of love stories where the connection between the main couple seems like a product of the plot, you get what makes them work as a couple and why people say this is couple goals, because you see their connection. They both have a passion for the game of basketball, which is always useful for building a relationship when you have a mutual thing to build it around. But for both of them, a key is that they both see through these blurred presentations of gender and how the world doesn't understand them. Everyone sees Monica as this intense tomboy, and she is, but that's what Quincy likes about her. He loves her intensity and passion. Conversely, she's the only person that he's able to be vulnerable around and that he's connected to in a way that isn't about his facade. In front of everyone else, he's a superstar, but to Monica, he's just Quincy from next door. So the question then has to be asked, what actually makes them break up? It starts with Quincy having a crisis of masculinity. The whole time, Quincy has aspired to be like his dad, a good, high-value man in his eyes. And when his father fails to live up to that aspirational ideal, or in my opinion, does what a lot of high-value men tend to do under patriarchy, that revelation that he cheated on his mom kind of breaks him. And it breaks his whole concept of who he is and who he was trying to be. And so he goes to the only other person he feels close to, which is Monica. Unfortunately, Monica's first love and definition of self is a baller. And unlike Quincy, who is a natural at basketball and really doesn't have the same passion and has always had it come easy to him, she's had to scrap to get really everything she's had in terms of playing this game. The night where Quincy needed her the most, he had to compete with basketball, and he lost. It's clear at this point that Quincy is pretty much done with the relationship. I've seen people say that this is an example of Quincy being spoiled and needing the relationship to be on his terms at all times, but I don't know if that really holds up. One thing that's made clear from pretty much jump in this movie is that Monica is the driving force in this relationship, that she is at a minimum his equal, but often leading wherever they're going. For all of Quincy's aspiration to be like his dad and the clear alpha status that he has in his social circle, when they're alone, it's Monica who often drives the ship. It's Monica who initiates their first sexual encounter. It's Monica who challenges him to the game at the end. Even from jump as kids, Monica made it clear that she wasn't just going to simply be led by him. And it's clear that that resonated with him. So I don't know if saying this relationship has always been one-sided is accurate. What it comes down to is Quincy needed for Monica to choose him over anything the way he would have chosen her.
And I had curfew. What was I supposed to do?
Stay!
If I stayed, I wouldn't be stark.
Well, at least you got your priorities straight.
I never asked you to choose.
You never have to.
And the realization that this wasn't the case is what drives him away. And that's understandable. This is also why later in the movie, when Quincy finds out that Monica has quit basketball, he feels bitter and jilted because to him, if he gave her up so she could pursue basketball with all her heart, to have her then give up on basketball makes him feel like he lost out on this woman he truly cared about. So going back to the toxic dating advice communities that you see out there, both those catering to men and women. A lot of these communities promote the aforementioned idea of emphasized femininity as what a woman should perform in order to land a man. We see this manifest in the film with the other women that Quincy deals with, from this nameless girl at the beginning to Gabrielle Union to later in the film with Tyra Banks. And all of this is also aligned with the hyperfemininity of both of their parents. Quincy, probably like most men, is not immune to the allure of women who check all the boxes of emphasized femininity. But recognize that Quincy chooses Tyra later in the film because he really just feels like that's what he's supposed to do. The almost childlike adulation and hyperfemininity of Tyra towards him and the role she plays in his life is what that framework is supposed to look like. But it's also pretty clear that these types of partnerships are unfulfilling to Quincy, that he does them just because it's something to do. And this is partially, again, due to the casual misogyny that he learns from his parents, but also because, as I mentioned in the Love video, these women are attracted to his artifice. And for him, that creates a sense of distance between him and them and makes their ability to become actually close much more unlikely. Quincy does not feel connected and vulnerable to these women like he did to Monica, which is why it's relatively easy for Monica to take him back once she steps back into the picture. We see this not long before the movie's finale when, after tearing up his knee, Quincy talks about quitting basketball and going back to school and how he suspects that Tyra Banks' character will not be happy with this decision.
Trying to be better than my pop. I was trying to try something different.
Like what?
I'm thinking about going back to school.
Wow.
Yeah, Kira hasn't heard about the school thing yet. She'll probably say it's the painkillers talking.
It's laughed off, but I think this is definitely a real conflict he's dealing with. Remember that at this point, he's only 24, 25 years old. He's wondering who he is as a man and if it's okay for him not to be the man everyone thinks he is, including his partners. Will Tyra Banks be okay with him going from being a baller to something else? So much of many partnerships, especially heterosexual partnerships, and especially in Black communities where you have these high status, high value couplings, the job and role of the man is more than just his ability to take care of bills or take care of a household. It's a source of pride for him and whomever he's partnered to. But for Quincy, none of that really matters in the end. What matters is the emotional connection he has to Monica. And this flies in the face of a lot of these theories with these dating gurus. Sure, you will definitely capture more men or have more opportunities at love as a woman if you have these features of emphasized femininity, depending on what type of men you're going after. There's a lot to be said about colorism and featureism, and I can't deny that. But the question that I tend to ask is, what does that type of performance and that type of partnership really guarantee women in a patriarchal society? Do you get what Nona got, Quincy's mom, a really nice house with a philandering husband that is never home? Do you get what Camille got, a loving husband and children that define your existence for better or for worse? And will it even work in the first place? Or will your high value men run off with a Monica? I'm sure Tyra's character with the big boobs and the big wig was a little salty that this tomboy just came in and snatched her man up like that with nary an effort. And that's another thing, because that's not so unrealistic. Lots of athletes marry other athletes. They still marry women they're attracted to, but like this idea of the trophy wife, of the hyper-feminine doll as the ideal thing that men want, not really true. And I'll leave some links or two in the description that tells us that. High value men, regardless of the definition you have for that, don't really marry hyper-feminine dolls or trophy wives who practice this emphasized femininity. They may still want that in their partners, and that's a whole other conversation, but men date and marry women in their social circles. Doctors are married to other doctors. Lawyers are married to other lawyers. And to be fair, in my cursory glance over the hellscape of relationship advice on YouTube, I do feel like I've seen a lot of women-oriented dating advice things led by women try to point this out, that you're not going to really capture a man by just being cute and sitting in one spot. But it still feels like nobody's really accounting for the reality of what it means to just wholesale buy into patriarchy as a man or a woman, especially from the perspective of women who are amassing capital themselves. Like, and this is just my opinion, it doesn't make sense to me for women to level themselves up just to go find a man that wants them to put all that shit down and render all that effort pointless. But I guess if there are choices between leveling up and being single, I don't begrudge anybody making that decision. So, you know, like I said, y'all, I'm married. Good luck out there. But before I really get into final thoughts, let's look at the final moment of the movie, the legendary basketball game. And this is another example of how we've memed this movie into a level of silliness that probably isn't fair to what the movie did. Don't get me wrong, the jokes about this game are funny, and it's a bit ham-fisted and corny in retrospect. But go ahead and line in the comments about how you weren't in your feelings when you saw this scene as an 18, 19, 20-year-old. So one thing that's ignored in this scene is how much shit talking Monica is doing at the beginning.
Three's it. Where's the D? Sleepy? So now you want to play. How you taking off your drinks, huh? You think that's gonna make you play better?
Also is about Monica redistributing her passion for basketball back onto Quincy. And on the flip side, Quincy is working through this bitterness on Monica and how she gave up on basketball after he decided to walk away from their relationship. I don't know if it's guilt or frustration. He doesn't take it seriously at first, but it's arguable that that shit talking, that intensity, is what gets him to engage not just with the game, but with his emotions in the moment. And so you see him take off his knee brace and get serious. And I want to point out it's a role reversal from what we often see in romance movies. Coming back to an earlier point, I think this movie is so easy to criticize and to get wrong because it subverts the forms of courtship in choosing versus being chose. How many romance movies and stories do we get where we see it's the woman being proactive in pursuing love as opposed to just waiting and being the object of a man's pursuit? I think this is what makes this moment seem more silly, although him headbutting her and dunking on her ass for the winning score maybe doesn't help my argument. Still, even though he wins, there's a beat where he realizes what he's doing wrong and why he's making a huge mistake again, and he relents, hopefully processing his bitterness, and then they live happily ever after. The last image is of him watching proudly from the sideline, holding their baby, and they even show you very purposefully but subtly that she hyphenated her last name. This drives home the fact that they are in a egalitarian and relatively gender subversive relationship, but it works and they're both happy. So wrapping up the analysis of this movie, especially under the specter of dabbling into these internet dating guru advice spaces, I want to make sure it's known again, I am not against traditional gender roles, representation. I'm not against hypergamy or traditional marriage dynamics. I'm not a proponent for struggle love. I'm not saying that people have to love people that don't fulfill them in whatever way they need. Life is short and hard, and to live it without love or partnership can make it shorter and harder. I won't begrudge you for anything you do seeking partnership that covers you emotionally and financially and allows you to pursue your dreams. I don't care what race, gender, complexion, or whatever it is that you're trying to get at that's legal. I wish love and wellness on everyone who wants it. But I do think it's important for us to be more critical of the frameworks that many of these dating advice gurus operate out of and how all of them are very much invested in patriarchy and patriarchal systems, which means they're invested in white supremacy and capitalism. And without getting into the political aspect of that, what that essentially means is that somebody is going to be exploited, and 9 times out of 10 is going to be the women. And now what I get from a lot of these women-led circles is that if the choice is between surviving and struggling in a patriarchal society on your own or possibly having the covering and protection of a man to help you along, makes perfect sense to me. I completely get that. But some of the advice is just really suspect. And then the racial fetishism of white men that happens in some of these communities and the anti-black rhetoric, I gotta be honest, like I knew, the male-oriented dating guru people were all trash. Like that's a trope I was very well aware of. We have these dating gurus for men who are selling this false dream of become a high-value man. Just do that shit. Just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and perform hegemonic masculinity, completely ignoring the large amount of black men, especially the black men who watch these types of videos, that they're lacking in the material conditions to ever achieve that status because of racialized barriers. And so the next function for these men is to just blame women for the reasons why they can't access these things, or blame women for not wanting to stick around for struggle love. And like I said, life's too short for that shit. At the same time, I see dating gurus geared towards women on one hand, making some really important points about calling out patriarchy and misogyny and all the ugly things that are normalized and long-standing in these black manosphere or general manosphere spaces, and in many cases advocating for women's empowerment. But then there's this line, and it's scary because this is how radicalization works. And Julesy talks about this in one of her videos. You start with just being about black women's empowerment, which I don't think anybody except for the worst niggas in the world would be against. And then at some point you start calling niggas bullet bags and pookies, and you start blaming black men for the Tulsa riots. And then it's like, how the fuck did we get there? And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's no decentering of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy in the empowerment for these black women. And if you know anything about algorithms, what you see for both of these groups is that content that makes you feel miserable and makes you angry will always have high engagement, which means it will always make money. And that's all most of these people are really trying to do. It's just a rabbit hole to drive engagement on and feed off your misery. And that's why, in retrospect, watching Love and Basketball was refreshing. Not because it was this perfect images of idealistic black love, but maybe because it was kind of the opposite on some levels, that it was imperfect, but still functional. And I feel like if we step away from the hot takes on Twitter and the Clubhouse rooms, and just return to why this movie connected with us when we were younger, before we had maybe some bad experiences in love. We realized that what made this movie appealing was that it was about emotional connection first, not status or patriarchy or hypergamy or just leveling up. It was a story about an intimate bond between two people. And I don't see anybody selling that in these dating guru streets. And just to be clear, I ain't either. This is the most you're gonna get out of me for this topic for a while, because the way these algorithms work, if y'all fools start coming to my channel, it's gonna fuck up everything else I'm doing. So I hope you've enjoyed me talking about the manosphere and divestment here, because it's not gonna be happening again anytime soon. That's pretty much it, y'all. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Please remember to click the bell. And I'm gonna talk about this in my next video, but legit, if you don't click the bell, it does not matter. it doesn't, but just wait. The next video, we're gonna get back to high interest topics, and it's gonna be a good one. I got some shit lined up for this one. But click the bell, like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. Thank you all so much for spending this time with me. That's all I got for today. Peace.